My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. I am here with Rich Berger. I am really excited about this episode because we are going to get in depth talking about one of the largest snake species on the planet. But it's an interesting species in the sense that we know a lot about this animal in some settings, in, say, husbandry settings and captivity. We know quite a lot about them relative to things like the skin trade. We know some things about them relative to like wildlife kind of conflicts with, people that live in the snakes range. But we actually don't know all that much about this animal's ecology in the wild compared to some other species. So, but Rich, relatively recently, completed his PhD where he was studying the ecology of reticulated pythons in the wild. So we're going to talk all about reticulated pythons. We may touch on some of those things, such as skin trade or conflicts humans have with them. But in general, we're going to talk about their natural history and their ecology because they're a fascinating animal. So welcome to the podcast, Rich. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I like to start all my episodes by getting to know, our guests and getting to know how they ended up getting to the place that they are today. And I want to start at the very beginning. And I want to learn, like, where did this interest in snakes or nature and wildlife and these types of things, how did that develop for you? Is that something that developed as a child or something that kind of came to you later in life?
It started very young as a child. I don't really remember a time when I wasn't interested in animals and, wanted to work in some capacity with animals. I think it started out like for most kids, fascination with dinosaurs. Which I still have, slowly worked towards more, extant species. I think a big influence for me was probably, like I imagine for many people, documentaries by David Attenborough, and I watched a lot of those and was just absolutely fascinated with the natural world and really wanted to.
Yeah. So from a child, you had an interest in these things. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in the Cotswolds in sort of southwest England. Living in a small village, and lots of rural areas and forests and wildlife around.
So did you have a interest in that time as a child when you were interested in wildlife and nature? Were you interested in snakes? Obviously, I mean, in southern England, you're in a pretty good spot for snakes, but in general, the UK doesn't have a lot of snake species. So is that something you experienced as a child, or is kind of your snake experiences, did that kind of hit you later in life?
That came a little bit later, yeah, probably in my early teens. I would say that I sort of became more fixated on snakes. There's not not a huge number of snakes in the UK. There's 3 species, and one of those is very, very limited distribution, and they're quite difficult to find, or especially they were around where I lived. It's wasn't the best place for seeing snakes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was always wanted to work specifically in the tropics. That was always my fascination. There's high biodiversity and not very much known about a lot of things there. So that always had my attention.
Yeah. So you grew up in an area I think the species in the UK are fascinating. We actually did an episode on those a while back, so I won't go into detail. But an interesting area for me, snake-wise, even though there's not a lot of diversity. But you grew up, and kind of in your teens, it sounds like this interest in snakes hit you, and this real interest in the tropics and biodiversity and areas with more snakes. So how did so you're finishing up high school, let's say, and in the southwestern part of England, and then you how did you know that this was even potentially a career? I mean, obviously you did, because you were thinking about the tropics and all of that, but what was kind of the next step? How did you end up getting into college, and where did you go, and were you able to link it to that interest in snakes and tropics and biodiversity?
Yeah, well, I think while I was in high school, I was lucky enough to be able to go on a school trip to Honduras, and I'd always wanted to go and be in the tropics and see the jungle. And while I was there, I met a couple of herpetologists and talked their ears off. And one guy who was there was actually radio tracking the rosy boas, the boa constrictors that occur on the little offshore islands of Honduras. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. I want to do that.
So you realized even in high school through this trip that it was possible. Where did you end up going to school, and did you end up studying biology? Was that kind of your first major, or did it come later?
So my major was zoology at Cardiff University in Wales. And I think I sort of, through the process of that, started realizing that I'm less interested in sort of some of the aspects of zoology, like physiology and that sort of area, and more ecology was kind of more the types of things that I was interested in. While I was an undergrad, Cardiff University has a field station in Borneo, in Sabah, Malaysian Borneo, and I got to go on a field trip as part of my undergrad to go visit there and learn about tropical conservation and ecology, and that was a really amazing place. And
did you find many snakes on that first trip, or?
Yeah, I found a few. It was I didn't get to go out and find them as much as I'd liked, because I unfortunately broke my leg while I was there, so I was hobbling around a little bit. I was very, very snake focused, and the professor who runs that place, Professor Benoit Augustins, he remembered that, and that'll become relevant later, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you go to Borneo, to this tropical region, interesting area from a snake perspective, and you're finishing your undergrad. And I know you were saying to me offline that you did a master's before the PhD. So how did you stay at Cardiff for the master's, and then how did that come about, and what what was it that you were working on? Did you start working on pythons at that time, or was it something else?
No, I went straight through from undergrad into a master's. At the time, Cardiff was one of, I think, maybe only two universities in the UK that offered an MRes, a Masters in Research, which is more less taught and more focused on doing your own sort of research project. So it's a year long program, and eight months or so of that is just carrying out a research project from start to finish, and a lot of training in just general bioscience research and how to write a grant and all of those kind of things to kind of prepare you for academia.
Yeah.
So I stayed at Cardiff, and my research was on Telfair skinks, which are an endemic lizard in Mauritius. So I started working on lizards because it was a little bit more difficult to find opportunities to work on snakes, but I'm not limited to that.
Yeah. And Mauritius is quite an interesting place. We do a lot of work in that general region on giant tortoises. It must have been an interesting place to be. So tell us a little bit about the research. What was it that you were doing with what'd you say it was, Telfair lizards?
Telfair skink. Yeah.
Okay. So just talk a little bit about the research project. I'm curious what your thesis was and what you found out.
Right. Well, I mean, in Mauritius, they have a really big problem with invasive species. The original ecology of that island was really cool, and it was, reptile based. So reptiles were performing a lot of the functions that might be performed by other taxa. But it's been largely decimated because of invasive species, and for the smaller lizards, that's particularly rats. And so the full lizard, or the full reptile, I should say, community was really only left on one tiny little offshore island where rats had never managed to get to. And so the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation there has been working for a long time, trying to bring a lot of these species that almost went extinct back. And part of that was trying to take these, this lizard community and to translocate them onto other offshore islands after they'd been cleared of rats, so that there's, they're in more than one place. So if something bad happens, there's still some left. So I was working on a little offshore island situated in a beautiful, like, crystal blue lagoon, where they'd translocated these Telfair skinks. But the problem was that they weren't doing very well. I forget how many exactly were translocated, but maybe around 250 or something like that. And they weren't breeding, as far as I could tell. And the reason is because there was another invasive species called the Asian musk shrew, which is highly commensal species. It lives around humans and in homes and things, and it really easily can get into little boxes and be carried in boats and things to different places. And so it's spread across a lot of the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. And they are voracious little things, shrews, and they will eat small lizards and eggs. And so what they were hoping for was that the Telfair skinks, which are quite large, they can be well over a foot long. The hope was that they would try to predate the shrews and bring the shrew numbers down. But really, what seemed to be happening was that the shrews were just eating all of the baby skinks. So there were all of these adults on the island, but no new ones.
So they took
coming in.
care of the invasive adult predators, and but had this major problem that they couldn't get any recruitment because the shrew was eating all the young. Oh, that's interesting. And so you were studying
Yeah.
that phenomenon, kind of documenting those dynamics, or
Yeah, so I was working on diet. And I was doing that with metabarcoding. And that's quite a widely used technique now, but at the time it was pretty new. And I mean, there weren't very many studies, if at all, really published on terrestrial species of actually doing that, of collecting the feces of animals and extracting the DNA of what they've been eating. So I was doing that. I was collecting feces from the skinks, and also at the same time from the shrews. But they're invasive, so it's more extracting guts because we didn't want to re-release them, and looking for competition between them, and also trying to see if we could find evidence of the shrews eating the skinks or the skinks eating the shrews. So yeah, and it was a really cool little study, and that was published in.
And so you found what you
2012.
were describing, that no, the lizards were not eating the shrews, but the shrews were eating the young age classes of the lizards.
Yeah, and we didn't actually find much evidence of direct predation of one on the other, but what we did do was get a whole array of invertebrate species that they were both eating. So we just barcoded the whole range of invertebrate prey that we could extract from the feces, and then looking to see how much overlap there was, and some predatory competition between the two species.
Yeah. Well, so you finish your master's working down there in the Indian Ocean, and then you end up going on for a PhD, also at Cardiff. And so did you go straight from the master's to the PhD? And I want to hear about the PhD, but we're going to talk in depth, because we're going to talk about the reticulated pythons here shortly. But I'm just more curious about that transition. How did you end up working in the Indian Ocean on lizards, and then at the same institution ending up going back to this site where you broke your leg, and assuming it's the same place, and starting to work on snakes. So how did that kind of all happen? Again, we'll get into the details of the research, but how did that all come together for you?
Yeah, well, I spent a bit of time doing other things. So there was a bit of a gap. I think I finished my master's in 2011 and started my PhD 2016. So there was a bit of a 5-year gap there, and I did a bit of volunteer work in South America, and doing research on lizards again, and worked for a time as a science teacher in a high school, and then I also got a job in, I don't know how to say it, one of these like a voluntourism type organization,
like tourism,
a lot of voluntourism, where you have a lot of volunteer students, young people who go to try to volunteer. So they're basically paying to do
gotcha.
to do work in a cool place. So I was living in Madagascar for a year and a half, almost 2 years, sort of in charge of the terrestrial research there and working on well, all species really, lemurs, birds, snakes, invertebrates, and coordinating a large number of volunteers.
Oh, that sounds amazing. There's some interesting snakes there as well. So then how did you go from that to going back to Cardiff and doing the PhD?
Yeah, so my best friend, who went through undergrad and the masters alongside me, he did his masters in Borneo on crocodiles, and he then started, I think, almost immediately went on to do a PhD working on saltwater crocodiles, which I was quite jealous of. But yeah, he kind of like called me up one day and was like, we're really interested in doing some work on reticulated pythons. Would you be interested? And obviously I said yes, because that was exactly what I wanted to do for a very long time.
And then you went to Cardiff and met with the faculty and just kind of all came together for you and you were off to Borneo.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was, I had a lot of freedom to completely design the project myself and figure out for the most part what it was going to look like and find funding and all of that kind of thing.
Mm. Great. Well, we won't get into the details of that now because, again, we're going to talk about pythons here. But kind of as the last stage of your how you get to where you are today, how did you, so you finished the PhD and you're currently sitting in Toronto, if I'm correct. And how did you end up, when you finished the PhD, how did you end up in Toronto and what are you doing these days?
So while I was working in Borneo, I met a woman who was researching macaques in a field station nearby, and I felt very hard for her. And she's Canadian, so we stayed together for I think 4 years while I was living out in Borneo, and for most of that she was back home in Toronto, so long distance relationship on complete opposite sides of the planet. And so when I finished, I packed my bags and moved to Canada, and then we got married.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So have you been able to, as a UK resident who's been working in the tropics and moves to Canada, has it been difficult to find work in this field or talk a little bit about that and then we'll get into pythons.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think it was a little bit difficult purely because I don't have the experience of working with wildlife in Ontario, so that was kind of a bit of an initial barrier. I am no longer working in academia. I'm working in ecological consultancy, but for a company that is very focused on reptiles specifically and conservation research more than just okaying building sites.
Snakes are one of the most persecuted groups of animals in the world, but we are dedicated to changing that. If you like what we've been discussing here on the Snake Talk podcast, here's an opportunity to turn that inspiration into action. Head over to www.orian.org and explore how you can support the Orian Society. Click on Take Action on our menu to make a difference.
Well, let's transition and let's start talking about reticulated pythons and kind of the way I want to structure this is kind of talk really just go through their kind of natural history and ecology and weave in aspects of your dissertation research as we go through, and then we'll kind of touch on anything from the research that we missed towards the end of that. But let's start off. Just most people know of reticulated pythons, but they probably actually know relatively little to nothing about them in the wild. So, where in the world do you find reticulated pythons? And then once you talk a little bit about their distribution, maybe just kind of talk specifically about the setting of where you studied them within their range, meaning, you've already said it's Borneo, but, talking about the types of forest and the topography and what's kind of that tapestry on which you studied them within the broader distribution.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they are actually one of the most widely distributed snakes. They're certainly up there. They range from sort of Bangladesh and the very east of India, all the way through Southeast Asia, maybe even up towards the border of China, and then all throughout Indonesia and Borneo and the Philippines. So Borneo is kind of slap bang in the middle almost of their range. And they're primarily tropical species, or subtropical even, and usually at relatively low levels. They don't go up too high into the mountains generally. So absolutely huge distribution, and yet really not very studied at all, despite being so ubiquitous.
Yeah.
But it's such a huge area.
So tell us a little bit about, you mentioned Borneo and you mentioned that they live mostly in tropical regions, but what is the place in Borneo where you were studying them like? Was it a rainforest? Was it some type of, dry forest, wetlands? What did that landscape kind of look like?
So that was in the state of Sabah, which is one of the two Malaysian states on the island of Borneo. So that's in the northeast of the island, and that state has a lot of its land area is oil palm. Has been converted to oil palm plantations, and so the research station where I was working, we were based along the Kinabatangan River, which is I think the second longest river in Borneo, and there is a little wildlife sanctuary along the banks of the river of just a few little remnant pockets of forest, of lowland dipterocarp forest, heavily degraded, and just completely surrounded to the horizon on all sides by just vast oil palm plantations. And so a lot of the research that we've been doing there has been looking at how various different species are able to sort of live in that kind of environment, and whether they're able to utilize oil palm at all. It's a really interesting area because so much of the forest has been lost and concentrated into these little areas. There's a huge amount of wildlife, and so it's really great place for tourists to go and see wildlife, and that's where a lot of documentaries are filmed.
Yeah. I, I, I was surprised to hear that. I just didn't think about it, but I should have not been surprised because I've spent a lot of time in the tropics and different places. And I just pictured this kind of pristine rainforest. It sounds like you have some patches of, forest, but it's going to be extra interesting to me now because I don't know if people in general realize in my mind, palm oil production is one of the greatest threats to a lot of our tropical forests, not just in Southeast Asia, but all around the world. And it's huge, like what you talked about, these expanses, like as far as you can see. And I've certainly seen that in places where, literally, as far as you can see, these forests have been converted to like a monoculture agriculture, so we can get these oils that we use in all kinds of things. So fascinating. And I'm actually really curious now to hear the pythons, because if I just, knowing nothing, if I had to predict, obviously the palm oil plantations are having huge impacts on wildlife. But if I had to predict, pythons might be one of the species that would do actually relatively well in those. I might be wrong, but don't tell me. But I'm throwing out like a hypothesis in the beginning. But yeah, that's fascinating. So, well, let's keep on with the python. So, is it throughout their range that it would kind of be these tropical, I'm assuming fairly wet forests, or because they have such a wide distribution, do they live in like a variety of different habitats, like some more dry forests and, kind of subtropical, maybe almost bordering on temperate? You mentioned getting close to China, or are they all pretty much associated with these kind of wet tropical rainforest type habitats?
I think probably historically that would be where you would typically find them, but they are generalists. They can be found anywhere, and they seem to be very, very adaptable. And for the most part, I think you can find them anywhere, including even within cities. There may be thousands of them living in the center of Singapore and Bangkok. These huge urban centers, they still are able to survive and even thrive in them.
Yeah, well, that's why, because I knew some of that's kind of why I predicted that compared to some other wildlife, they might do well in palm plantations. But let's talk about how they look. They're a pattern snake that a lot of people are probably familiar with. We don't need to get into that. But what I want to focus on is probably the biggest superlative about this animal. I mentioned in the intro, it's one of the largest snakes on the planet. So maybe just talk about reticulated pythons and their size relative to to other species of snakes or large snakes around the world. And I'm also curious, like, what it takes for them to get there. Is it, when you see a giant python, are they 20 years old, and we may not know this, but, and how plastic is that? Is that, say some animal is living in a city that's eating rats all day. Does this thing grow? Is it that much bigger than one living out in a forest? So anyways, just talk about their size, if you would, because it's just such it's probably what's known best about them, that they're really big.
Yeah, exactly. They are considered to be the longest reptile in the world. I think the only one that could potentially sort of compete with that is the green anaconda. But compared to the green anaconda, they're a lot more slender. So they're a lot more like a big noodle rather than a sausage, I suppose you could say. But they supposedly could reach, maximum lengths of 8 to 10 meters, which would be what?
30 25, 30 feet, yeah.
But to some degree, that's speculative. think there is a $1 million prize for anyone who can find a reticulated python that's 10 meters, which hasn't been claimed yet.
Yeah. So but they are really large snakes. Do you know much about the growth? Like I was talking about, does it take them long to get to those large sizes, or is it something they do relatively quickly? And then how much does it vary? Is it real plastic trait, meaning some snakes can grow really, really fast and some don't? Like in some rattlesnake species, for example, we see that.
Yeah, I think it is very plastic. And I think it's quite surprising how quickly they can grow, though. And I think particularly for people who are perhaps used to working on temperate species, you'd be really surprised. They don't have, they don't have to spend half of the year, dormant during winter or anything. So that as long as they have enough food, they can grow very, very rapidly. I think it's very difficult to know what that's like on wild animals, but I think there are claims that if you're able to feed them enough in captivity, they can grow from when they come out of an egg, they're maybe 2 foot long, and they're born, and within a year they could reach 6-8 feet. Wow. If you in some cases, yep. if you really pile them with food. So yeah, the growth rate is essentially dependent upon how much they can eat.
Yeah. Huh. How if I remember right, there was some discussion among scientists about subspecies. We talked about distribution, and I wanted to say there was like 3 or 4 kind of proposed subspecies. Do you know much about that? Are they indeed considered subspecies? Are they all considered one? And do you know kind of general distribution of that? I mean, this is getting kind of deep, so you may not, it's outside the realm of your dissertation, but just curious if you know much about that, the subspecies discussion.
Yeah, so I don't believe that it has been something that's been agreed upon. There have been a couple of different genetic studies of them, and it sort of looks as though the ones that are sort of in Borneo and the Philippines may be slightly separate from the rest of their range, and the ones in the mainland again maybe slightly different. I think in some cases you might be able to tell by looking at them to a degree. I mean, I think I see a lot of photos of them from, say, like Thailand, where they maybe look like they have a little bit more yellow than the ones that I've been working on. But I think for the most part, I don't know if there's actually good evidence for considering them subspecies.
Back to the size thing a little bit, just thinking about, we talked about like in certain situations they can grow very rapidly. We talked about them being the longest snake in the world. Like when let's say at your study sites for your dissertation and you're heading out in the field to say capture snakes for whatever you're doing, like what's kind of like a size distribution that you might find? Is it typical for you to find mostly like 8 to 10 foot snakes, and you don't see a lot of young ones, and you don't see a lot of over 15 footers, or like if you're just going out looking for these snakes as part of your study, what's kind of like a size distribution you might expect to see?
That's a good question, because they are known for being very, very long, but most of them aren't. And that's partly because the larger they are, the less time they're spending out in the open, and so the less easy they are to actually detect. But we're looking at sort of 2 to 4 meters really as being the sort of where most of them that you typically find would be. So more of a medium size.
Yeah. Gotcha.
So that kind of size, they would be eating, small mammals like squirrels and rats, that kind of thing, rather than these huge ones that are eating, pigs and people.
I want to get into the people thing, but we'll do that towards the end. And before we get in, I want to talk about diet as well. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit, and this will, I think, get into start getting a little more directly related to your dissertation. I want to talk a little bit about like movements and kind of habitat use of reticulated pythons in the wild. And I'm curious, what we might know generally, but I'm also very curious about your study sites on these kind of isolated small forest patches and, in this kind of palm oil plantation matrix. So just tell us a little bit about what we know with reticulated python movements, home range, any of those types of things, and anything we know about their habitat use at different scales.
Prior to me working on this, there wasn't really very much known at all. There's one person that I know of that studied them, putting radio trackers in them and following them around in a plantation. But I don't believe that research has been published. So when I started, completely in the dark about what to expect. And it seemed reasonable to assume, they're quite large animals, that they would have, really large ranges. But they're actually surprisingly small, I would say. I was expecting to be, trekking for miles to try to follow these things, but they actually sort of typically stay in a relatively small area.
And was that similar amongst, like, say you had, and maybe you didn't have this set up, but let's just say you had one individual that was in, these remnant patches of forest, and then you had one individual that was in the palm plantation. Did you see a difference in movements between those types of habitats?
Yes, I did. Yeah, no, that was one of the main questions that I had, because they are able to adapt so well to oil palm plantations. I was interested to sort of see if there were if it was possible to see any sort of potential effects of that might be having. Like, do they behave differently in these these big artificial monoculture habitats compared to in a more natural environment? And that is what I found. That there does seem to be a bit of a difference. They typically move less in oil palm plantations than they do in forest. At least that's how it appears.
And did you have any data or even speculation on why that might be? Is it, there's more, I could see, say, it's probably monoculture-ish itself, but, more, say, food potentially in the form of mammals and other things in the palm plantation. Do you have any speculation or data on what that might be?
I have speculation, for sure. Oil palm is really interesting because it is incredibly productive. It's producing these oil dense fruits. They can be harvested every 2 weeks, year round. And so there's just this abundance of food for other animals, and what that typically means is there's a lot of rats. There's a lot of rats that living in these plantations and feeding on the palm kernels. And pythons eat rats. I think when I initially started, I probably imagined that they might be moving more in plantations because it's a more open environment, and there's disturbance, and I sort of imagined it as being very barren, but really they move a lot less in plantations, and that's probably because there is just so much food.
Yeah,
there are so many rats. They don't need to go anywhere.
yeah. If you focus in on the more native forest, what did you see kind of within that landscape with these snakes? I'm assuming it's a little more diverse. I don't know if there's topography or not, but certainly diversity of vegetation. I'm sure wetlands, potentially creeks, things like that. How did you see these snakes using those landscapes? You said they have larger home ranges, but was there anything else you noticed about how they'd use the landscape?
Yeah, so that area, as I said, was fairly degraded, like previously selectively logged, 50 years ago or so, and so like very, very dense jungle, a lot of vegetation under the canopy, and very, very swampy, low-lying areas, which is very difficult to move through.
I bet.
But they do seem to behave differently. They're the kind of places that they're choosing to rest up and to I don't want to say sleep, but they'll sit around not doing anything for.
Yeah. Well, snakes do sleep
for a while.
So they could be sleeping.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
they can't close their eyes, but they do sleep.
Resting, sleeping, digesting a meal, that sort of thing. They'll sometimes be holed up for 2 or even 3 weeks, just in the same like little tangle of roots or whatever, just not moving at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they maybe do that a little bit more, like not moving. They do that a little bit more or they appear to do that a little bit more in the more natural forest areas than they did in plantations.
Gotcha. So I can envision, like, habitat use wise, kind of, they're used to habitats in the non-plantation, the forest habitats. But I'm just thinking about these plantations, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like I'm just curious, like, the snakes are obviously not sitting out on the surface all the time. They're more of a, they're not up in the palms, I'm assuming, much. But again, you can correct me on any of this. And I'm picturing the palm plantations as like, I've seen them. So you've got these palms as far as you can see, and I'm assuming it's kind of relatively open, bare ground underneath with like probably something like canal ditches, like water to access them or for irrigating them, or I might be wrong on all that, but like how are the snakes, like from like a microhabitat component within the palm plantations, how are they using those habitats? Like they're obviously not out on the surface all the time. Like where are they going for cover and these types of things in these plantations?
Yeah. So I think the way in which these plantations are managed is really important as to how good they are as a habitat. A lot of the plantations around where I was working, because it's low-lying land next to a big river, it's really prone to flooding, and so they have these huge drainage ditches sort of between every row of trees, and that's filled with vegetation and usually filled with stagnant water, and so they're primarily using those and also appearing to use those as like little highways to move around, so that sort of their movements are sort of in long straight lines, because they're just swimming along these little ditches.
Did they, for whatever reason, they didn't move as much? This may impact this, but I'm assuming there might be more like direct persecution, like in these palm plantations. I mean, people are obviously working in there, and I'm assuming any snake that they see, they would potentially kill. I mean, did you see much of that? Was there like lower survival, you think, in the palm plantations because of persecution, or nothing you could notice?
Yeah, I think that's fair. A lot of people are very scared of them. Um, yeah,
So probably some of them
people
are getting killed.
want to protect their their livestock and their children.
Yeah.
Um, um, and so yeah, I did witness a few that had clearly been killed by plantation workers, and there were, I think, three of the pythons that I was tracking in plantations that found dead and suspected killed, but usually rotted to the point that you couldn't really tell.
Yeah.
But I think that's definitely something that happens. But also there's a lot of people who are just absolutely terrified and won't go near them. And they see a 1 meter python, and they're scared that it's going to eat them. But because I've been talking to a lot of people around there, they'd call me and be like, "There's a python here. Please come grab it."
Whether you're passionate about preserving biodiversity, ensuring the survival of threatened species, or simply want to contribute to a healthier planet, there's a role for you. Your support isn't just a contribution, it's an investment in a future where our ecosystems thrive. Go to www.orian.org to donate or become a member today.
We've been talking about diet a little bit. We talked about, in the palm plantations, but talk a little bit, I don't know if you studied this as part of your dissertation, but talk a little bit about diet and, say in the palm plantation, what you might expect or have seen in the forest. And you might, at the end of that, kind of weave in, you keep hinting at the idea that they eat people. Maybe talk about that a little bit. And, are they eating just kids? Are they eating, what else? Are they eating pets? Are they eating livestock? Hit that component at the end, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. They eat anything, really. I think mostly mammals and birds, but they will also eat reptiles, and probably I would imagine they might eat fish as well. Most of what we know about their diet is based on looking at the stomach contents of animals that are killed in slaughterhouses, and those predominantly come from plantations or from near villages. So there's a huge range of different species that have been found being eaten by them, but it is predominantly rats. But I would imagine that their diet is even more broad outside of plantations in forested areas where there's a greater diversity of species. And yeah, they've been recorded even eating. There's one instance of somebody who was radio tracking a sun bear, and then found it inside the 7 meter python.
Wow.
Yeah, they'll eat. The really big ones can eat wild boar, and they are potentially a problem around people with eating livestock, eating people's chickens and goats and things. And yeah, they are the only species of snake that is really regularly recorded as eating people. There are quite a number of instances of that having happened.
I mean, is it something that happens on an annual basis? At least one person gets eaten? I mean, just again, I know you're kind of speculating, but like based on what you know, would you think that at least it happens every year somewhere, multiple times a year, or every however many years?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's fair. I mean, if there's actually ever proper evidence of it happening. You know, you can find these gruesome videos online of these snakes being cut open and a person inside, and it usually makes news. But I would imagine that there's a lot of cases where that happens and nobody knows. I mean, they're very secretive and they're very difficult to find. They're incredibly well camouflaged, really good at hiding. You know, I can imagine that there's certainly instances in you know, very rural areas of people going off into the forest and never coming back, and nobody knows what happened to them.
Huh. How about?
But I would say it's incredibly rare.
Yeah.
You know, most snakes are most of them aren't big enough to be able to eat a person.
Yeah. How about reproduction? Let's talk a little bit about that. So they're obviously oviparous, they're like egg layers. And so talk a little bit about what we know with reproduction. And we already talked about movements and things like that. So are the males versus females, are they doing different types of movements, habitat use based on, you know, say breeding seasons? And maybe talk a little bit about, you know, the eggs, how many eggs and where female might put them and those types of things. What do we know about reproduction, I guess?
So they, as you said, they lay eggs, and that will typically be a clutch of, you know, maybe sort of 20 to 30, I think is probably the average, but, you know, up to, I don't know, 100, 120 could be the case for extremely large ones. The number of eggs that they lay is kind of almost sort of linear with their size. So as they grow and age, they will lay larger and larger clutches of eggs. And like most pythons, the females they guard the eggs. So they'll lay a big clutch in a big ball, somewhere, you know, warm and moist and safe, and then spend most of the time while they're incubating for about 2 to 3 months, just coiled around those eggs and keeping them safe and keeping the moisture in.
Huh. Yeah, that's fascinating. And so, do the females eat much while they're nesting, or do we not know anything about that, or do they just?
I don't believe they typically will eat much, and possibly not even drink all that much either. And there have been a few. There were a couple that I found sort of on their nests, and a few that you find sort of after they've just finished nesting, and they don't look great. You know, really emaciated and look a little bit worse for wear. I think it takes an awful lot out of them to use all of their resources to make the eggs and then to just sit there not eating for months on end.
And do we know if there's any parental care after hatching? Like, so for example, in rattlesnakes, which are ovoviviparous, but once the eggs come out and the young essentially come out of the female, most rattlesnake species will stay with the young for about 10 days. Is there anything like that, or do we even know? Or do they just hatch and leave, or what's kind of our knowledge about parental care beyond the nest guarding?
Not a lot, as far as I'm aware. Not that I've found. I mean, I would imagine that they sort of stay with the young for a little while, a few days. I mean, one of the ones that I found, female was still guarding the eggs, but the eggs had hatched, and there were still a few of the young sort of hanging around there. So I don't know how long they'd been sat there, but I imagine mother probably guards them still for a few days until they disperse away.
Do they have many predators in the wild at really any age class?
Yeah, they definitely do. You know, when they're young, they're pretty vulnerable, and so anything that would eat sort of snakes of that sort of size,
So kind of
2 foot.
mammals, raptors, things like that.
Yeah, mammals, raptors, crocodiles have been
Yeah.
seen eating big ones. But for the most part, I think once they reach a certain size, most things aren't gonna be a problem for them.
Gotcha. Well, we're getting close to wrapping up here, but the main part of your dissertation we talked about was, kind of that comparison between the palm plantations and the forest. And we talked mainly about movement and habitat. Are there any other kind of important components of your dissertation research that we didn't touch on that you'd like to, share with us?
One of the things that I was doing was tracking individuals in forests and plantations, but another aspect was actually just surveying for them, because that's really a big part of the reason why there isn't very much research on them is because they're so difficult to find, and so that makes it really difficult. If you go to go and try and study them and go for a field season of 3 months, you might not catch anything, or a very few, and you can't really do anything with if you only caught like 4 or 5 animals in 3 months. So I was living in a research station in the middle of the jungle for 5 years continuously, so that gave me a really good opportunity to actually do a much longer term study to try and get a handle on what the best way is to survey for them and get some actual numbers. This is kind of important because of the how do I say this? Reticulated pythons are the most heavily traded snake species in the world for their skins, and maybe 500,000 of them are sort of being taken out for the skin trade per year, plus maybe a similar number again illegally. So that raises concerns for a lot of people as to the sustainability of the skin trade, and what a lot of people would like in order to feel more confident that the skin trade is sustainable would be to conduct field studies, to get estimates of population and density and that sort of thing. But it's incredibly difficult to try to get estimates of their population. They have they're across the whole of Southeast Asia, and they're just very, very difficult to find. And what I was lucky enough to be able to figure out was that along the riverbanks, they seem to congregate to a degree along the edges of riverbanks, and I suspect probably for ambush hunting. So when the river level's gone down a bit and you've got a bit of exposed like mud banks, you can see like the python heads at night, shining with a torch. You can see their heads just poking out of the edge of the vegetation, and they show up much more clearly against the background of light mud than they do against leaves in the forest. So that was the primary way in which I surveyed for them, was just sitting in a boat with a torch and going up onto the riverbank and grabbing them.
Yeah, so you essentially found an effective way to survey for them that can be used by people in the future to better understand their status, to understand whether how sustainable the skin trade is. So real kind of applied part of the dissertation there. That's great. That's fascinating. I've been down mainly looking for jaguars and other things, but down in the Pantanal and we would find anacondas in a similar way, riding these rivers and looking at the riverbanks in the dry season. But anyways, that's a story for another podcast. So any other components of your dissertation that you think are worth mentioning?
Well, I mean, I mean the results of sort of surveying them and trying to figure out basically how easy it would be to conduct surveys on this species. The answer is very difficult. I think even though I found a way to find them with regularity, we're still having to survey 25 kilometers of riverbank for every python that I caught on average.
Wow. Oh, I was picturing you riding up the riverbank, seeing 3 or 4 in a relatively short reach, but.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, certain nights there would be several that I might get at night, but then there would be long periods of time where I don't see anything. So that's an average. But yeah, the weird thing about them is I think people think that they're so rare. They're a top predator, and if you go looking for them, they're really difficult to find. You don't see very many of them. I think maybe sort of think about them in terms of being similar to like a tiger in terms of their sort of density, and that's really not what's going on at all. Most of them, you're just not seeing them. Mm-hmm. They're just hidden.
Yeah.
And so I think the density of them is incredibly difficult to estimate. But
did you have any
really quite high?
I don't know if you calculated it, but maybe you could even speculate. So you had transmitters on snakes, right? And so you're obviously going in and locating these snakes. Like, if you had to guess, and maybe you actually have data on this, like how often when you went in to track a snake, could you see it, or how difficult are they to see on these different locations? Is it usually like they're under some vegetation and you would never see them just walking through the forest underwater or whatever it might be? But just anything you gathered from the telemetry on the general detectability of these snakes out in the landscape.
Yeah. So they're nocturnal. They're mostly active during the night. But for practical and safety reasons, I wasn't going and following them around at night. That would be incredibly difficult. Macheteing your way through crocodile-infested swamps to try to find them. Most of what I was doing was during the day when they're sort of resting up, and yeah, most of the time you just don't see them. And if it wasn't for the fact that I could be like, it is literally here within this, 2-foot square, mm-hmm. And searching through vegetation or whatever. That's the only way I was able to find them. And you would never know that there was a 4 or 5 meter python, a couple of feet away from you otherwise.
Interesting. Great. Well, we've been going for over an hour now, so I think we should begin wrapping this one up. But fascinating conversation. Just an animal that is just, again, purely because of his size, always been fascinating to me, but I've really known very little about. So glad to know that we're starting to learn some more about them in the wild. I like to have all of my guests tell me a good snake story. And so I'm wondering, Rich, do you have a good snake story for us today?
Yeah, I do. I think the thing that interested me, or surprised me, I should say, when I started this was I was expecting them to be really difficult to catch, based upon seeing them in captivity and like being quite defensive and bitey and that sort of thing. But actually, for the most part, catching them was really easy. You could just walk up to them and just grab them behind the head and stick them in a bag, without too much problems. But that was less easy the bigger they got, and also I found that ones that I was recapturing, so the ones that I'd already caught previously, they seem to learn, or that's how it appears. They're like, oh, there's a torch shining on me. I remember what happens, and so they immediately start running away, or slithering away, I should say. So the first time I sort of went out with my now wife, we'd only briefly just started dating, and I wanted to take her out and show her what I do, and hopefully catch a python. And we also had some visitors to the field centre, with just a couple of small children who were really excited. And I found, while we were surveying in the boat, I found a snake on the riverbank, with just a huge expanse of soft mud between the boat and the edge of the riverbank. And so went to try and catch it, but it started running away. And the problem there is the mud is so thick and soft that you're wading through it sort of up to your chest sometimes. So trying to catch this animal is trying to get away, so grabbing it by the tail and trying to pull it towards me and get it into a position that I could grab the head and make it safe. And my wife was standing there next to me and absolutely terrified. She had no idea what was going on, and this snake was I'd say 4.5 meters long, so it was quite big and extremely strong. And the other guys who were supposed to be helping me catch it, because I'm not going to do that on my own. If it gets around your neck, it'll, that's good night if you're on your own, because you can't get it off. And they were all just flailing in the mud, 20 meters away, and this thing was like rearing up into her face, and I was trying to haul it back, stop it from biting her, and she's screaming, but she can't run away because she's stuck in the mud, and then one of the guys comes over to help catch it, and he just falls over, and the snake bites him in the foot, and it was a big a great way to introduce her to what I do. But,
that's great. You didn't scare her away either. It sounds like you ended up married. So.
Still together, yeah.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a night out. Catching them in general just sounds fun. I am glad you told that story though, because that is one of the questions I wanted to ask you, but I forgot. As I just wanted to ask you, like, how do you catch one of these giant animals? So I'm glad that was part of your story. So. Well, Rich, again, I enjoyed this conversation, and I really thank you for joining us on Snake Talk today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
And I just want to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember, snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.